set?
Yep, it's recording.
Alright. Anyway, this is my dad, Ernie Cates. He's a United States Marine Corps retired, and going to go across some of his history for those who have never heard it, or those who want to hear it again, because a lot of the stories throughout the years have always been my favorites, and I thought it'd be nice to get them out there so anyone could just look them up. And there's the stories from the judo career specifically, starting with martial arts, and there's also the Vietnam years, which both are kind of like blocks unto themselves. I don't know which, where would you start?
I think what the audience most likely would be more interested at this point in time in the martial arts philosophy, physiology, and just what we're all about as far as get rid of more of the mythology than there is out there.
Yeah, if that's what you're, if you have a goal to do that, that sounds good to me. I always like paring things down to the actual truth, which I think the martial arts does get. It's a share of bluster that distorts the issue.
Yeah, we have probably the most maligned and misquoted and misunderstood art in the nation. Get more publicity and more wrongful publicity than any other. And most of it is created not by the unknowing or not by the individual just speaking in general, but it's self-created by the self-created martial arts experts. We used to joke about it in teaching Marines back in the 60s. Remember, martial arts in the United States in the 50s and 60s were pretty new. We had what was called judo throughout the martial arts world, in the military and police work where it was most publicized. Everything having to do with the martial arts structure was known as judo. I used to tell recruits, and I'd like you to listen particularly to how this is put because of the numbers that are involved and the simple math involved, that there were probably in the United States no more than from 800 to 1200 valid actual martial arts practitioners that were graded in the black belt categories.
Graded by the Kodokan and people like that.
Right, you had the world headquarters of judo, and the ones that invented the belt system itself were the Kodokan in Tokyo. Dr. Kano did it. And as I say, there were probably around from 800 to 1500 actual valid practitioners within the United States that were graded, validly graded as black belt practitioners.
Now when you say this, it's like there's a divide in the time. What era would you say this is in? What decades are you specifically?
Specifically, I was involved in it during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, which were the years that the formation of the martial arts were just coming of age. We're actually hearing about, quote, black belt. And you had these stories out there about in order to achieve your black belt rating, you had to have been able to maim or kill someone in the grade that you were aspiring to. This was common. The idea that a black belt was something so mysterious. Again, let's go back to the numbers, because math is easy to understand. There are probably from 800 to 1,500 valid, actual, graded, and certified black belts, going from the rank of first degree black belt up through fourth degree black belt in the United States. Something above fourth degree black belt was almost unheard of.
Now, did you, in your olds, give a brief history of your original school that a lot of people are familiar with, because you had a lot of people come out of there, and it's spidered all over this country. The students that came out of there, Grandmaster Nagel, Grandmaster Ron Duncan, all the people that they're Grandmaster titled now, Sensei Ed McGrath, all these people. Now, when you say, it makes it sound like then it was tough to get a black belt, and that if you...
Oh, it was almost impossible.
Yeah, and what was your grade at the time you were running that school, for
Well, let
instance?
me jump back here to the simple math. There are probably from 800 to 1,500 valid, actual, recognized internationally black belts within the United States. And I used to tell the recruits that there were at least 3,000 to 8,000 of them living in New York City alone.
Yeah.
It was ridiculous. Everybody that studied, when you talk to the layman, if he had had an hour's worth of lessons, he would tell you about his instructor, who was a black belt. That was, man, was he really good. That instructor he was deadly. He was awesome. By what criteria? This individual had had an hour's instruction from some turkey that probably taught him how to kick and punch wrong, that probably had a self-made black belt rating, and this young man taking this 1 hour's lesson knew that the guy he was listening to, that he was taking lessons from, must have been awesome, must have been great. What was he comparing it to?
Yeah.
You know, what was the standard of the day? Well, the standard of the day started in Japan. That's where the Dr. Kano in 1889, a long time ago, not 100 years ago, not 200 years ago, not 300 years ago. In 1882, a young man who was at the time approximately 21, 22 years old was studying an art called Jiu-Jitsu, or Jiu-Jitsu, as some of them pronounced it.
Yeah.
Which meant gentle art. There was nothing in the world gentle about Jiu-Jitsu. Jiu-Jitsu was a rough and tumble scientific method of back alley fighting.
Yeah.
And he had studied Jiu-Jitsu with other practitioners who were carrying on traditions that were questionable. Of course, a tradition has to have a history. And so there was an awful lot, and still is, an awful lot of history that was very, very colorful and very, very exaggerated. I mean, if, for example, the book of 5 Rings, which is a martial arts
That's like a Bible.
Bible. It's a basis of martial arts philosophy. It's a basis of martial arts physiology. It was written by Musashi, who was at the time especially in the Orient, because of, remember we're narrowing down to a small portion of the world, but in the Orient he was considered the world's greatest swordsman, and today is considered to have been the world's greatest swordsman because he had killed so many people who had reputations, who had gradings from other great swordsmen's schools and so forth. Musashi only had one student. One. He taught for the shogun in what was then the capital of Japan. He had taught the general soldiers how to basics of utilizing the sword, the basic philosophy of sword fighting. But as far as students or disciples, or someone who was to carry on his art and his philosophies and all, the Book of 5 Rings was written as an instructional manual for one person. Musashi was an eccentric. He spent his latter years living in the mountains in a cave with one student, who he wrote this manual for, telling him the basics of how he understood swordsmanship should be, and how it should equate to everyday living. To strike first, to strike without mercy, to utilize things that nobody else had thought about, such as if you were going to have a personal quarrel with another individual, you try to have it as early in the morning as possible, with just a few seconds on each side, just like a duel was back here in the States.
Right.
But you tried to have it early in the morning so that you could have your back to the east and be facing the west. And basically that was because the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. And if you have the sun rising in the east and you had your back to the sun, your opponent had his eyes at the sun and so couldn't see you. So you, first of all, could get in the quickest and the first strikes because your opponent couldn't see them coming. He was blinded by the sun. That was a basic that is in the Book of 5 Rings. A basic that he actually utilized in a very famous duel between him and another famous samurai on a beach on a little island there off the shore of Japan.
Well, you started off referencing the level of, I guess, way to put it, just be the level of BS that was in New York and so forth. And this is the 5 Rings is I always thought was pretty reasonable historically, and it's what he wrote for his student. Is that what's your reference on the exaggerations of the day now as compared to then? Do you think because there were only a few valid 800 to 1500, like you said, and there were a lot of bluster going on in New York that you referenced, is that affected today? Is that like tradition? Is BS a tradition in the martial arts?
Basically.
You know, because I've heard some as well, and I'll be honest with you, Dad. You know, growing up as your son, I would tell people about my dad in in school. You know, we lived on base and stuff. And you were in the Marine Corps at the time, and I tell people about it, and they say, "Oh yeah, sure." Or I tell them back when you got out of the Marine Corps, we moved on to Michigan, California, so forth. And I tell them in school, after your Marine Corps career, you retired, I tell them about the things you did, and they say, "Oh yeah," because they thought it was exaggeration, or that it was complete fiction, or that I was some delusion kid just proud of his dad just making stuff up. Now, some of that stuff was, it does sound, and I knew what they meant, some of the things that, some of the stories that I would say.
Okay, remember, during the 40s, we had the Second World War. It was the Japanese lost. They then came under the rule of the United States, and the guru at the time that ran the Oriental world was General MacArthur,
Right?
or Dugout Doug, as the Marine Corps troops used to refer to him as. He had a rather colorful background. Probably the one that he should be remembered the best for was his his family's company, which turned out Filipino beer. Yeah, however, he was a great politician. He had some good military structure that nobody else had thought about. Instead of attacking one island at a time, he leapfrogged from one island, cutting off the other ones by taking this one that was closer to Japan,
Right.
which isolated the ones that he bypassed. Good strategy. But MacArthur was named as the general, the sole governing power of the Japanese Empire. What had been the Japanese Empire prior to the signing of the treaty
Right.
there in Tokyo. He outlawed all martial arts in the Orient.
Mm-hmm.
All of them.
Why was that? Do you have any
Because
insight?
historically, the different forms of unarmed combat had developed during times of following high impact fighting, such as prior to the Tokugawa reign in Japan, hundreds of years ago. The shogun outlawed the carrying of swords. People couldn't carry a sword. They tried to defend themselves. Didn't have a sword anymore. So they developed wooden swords, called it a bow.
Oh, yeah.
They developed the bow. The bow is nothing but a stick that the farmers carried across their shoulders when they balanced 2 bags of rice or 2 buckets of potatoes, or 1 kid and a bucket of potatoes, and they carried it back and forth to the fields. But the bow was handy. It was a nicely formed stick, and that stick turned into a weapon, and that was Bojitsu, the way of a stick. The hand-to-hand combat became commonplace because no one had weapons. And so they learned to use their hands and their feet as, quote, weapons. And that was sort of the beginning of hand-to-hand combat. MacArthur knew enough history, having spent almost his entire military career in the Far East, that he knew that to allow them to move from having guns, by the way, the Japanese gun and the Japanese weapons of the Second World War were far inferior to anybody else's. The only thing that they did smart was they had their weapons chambered 1 millimeter bigger than ours. Not many people knew that. They're chambered 1 millimeter bigger than ours because they could fire our ammo, but we couldn't fire theirs. However, their weapons, such as the Nambu, was famously inaccurate, and it jammed a lot. It wasn't a very good weapon, still isn't. The Japanese are not noted for their firearms. They are noted for their swords.
Real quick, do you think that martial arts, because it's never mentioned in movies or on like the History Channel or anything like that, you think martial arts played a role for them in like modern warfare? Modern warfare being World War II, I mean, and on up.
Yes, it became, the Japanese became famous for their close-in fighting, hand-to-hand combat. There was an argument once took place a long time ago between several military experts pertaining to who were the best jungle fighters in the world. And somebody said the Filipinos were, somebody said the Africans were, somebody said the Japanese were, somebody said the Americans were. And the argument that took place in this little room among these experts was, well, the Japanese soldier was the best jungle fighter in the world. He proved that during the early years of the Second World War. And someone else says, no, the Americans were the best jungle fighters in the world. The Japanese says, no, they weren't. The Americans said, of course they were. We beat the Japanese in the jungles. No, you didn't. Your Navy came in and your Air Force came in and removed the jungles. Then you beat the Japanese. But not while the jungle was still there.
That's borne out by a lot of photo evidence.
Yeah. So, you know, there's a basis of truth to a lot of the fallacies pertaining to, quote, warfare, be it warfare at a distance or warfare close in. Warfare close in, the Japanese had a system of utilizing the other person's strength and size against him, to the point where a small man could defeat a large man. Not as a rule. The bigger, stronger man as a rule won. But it was possible for a strong man to get skillful enough to beat a large man. Sone Sensei was one of Kano's original students. He was less than 5 feet tall and was considered the deadliest, most vicious street fighter in all Japan, to the point where after Kano started the school of the Kodokan in the early 1800s, or late 1800s rather, around 1888 or 89, Sone developed such a reputation for beating up big people. He would pick fights in the streets for beating up and hurting big people, that Kano ostracized him and forbid him to go into any judo school for 2 years. He was kicked out of the Kodokan for a 2-year period because he was a bully at 5 foot tall.
Now you kicked off the conversation with, again, references to exaggeration, and I smile about it because there are some bigger than life characters, and they were few and far between, as you pointed out as well. So they stand out more. So the exaggerations about them, and plus, story to story to story, things get bigger and better. And you're a victim of some of that too. And so now I can see why, with these big, larger than life personalities. You can see why through the many decades, stories get big. And these are the people that folks come to, they kind of like admire them. And they want to be seen that same way, so they themselves have the roots of their own exaggeration, So I think you're kind of uncovering martial arts human condition-wise, why people do that.
Oh yeah, in the very popular UFC today, one of the deadliest things that's done in the UFC, one of the winningest techniques, is the Kimura.
Yeah.
It's an armbar. It's named after Kimura. Kimura was not just any judo player that came along and challenged a Brazilian. Kimura was a professional wrestler. Kimura was a judo student and expert. He was an animal. He was a powerful, big, strong man that made his living beating up other people for money.
Wow.
And one of the most famous fights in history is blown out of proportion because Kimura, in a professional fight in Brazil, fought against Helio Gracie. Helio Gracie was not a big man, but he had an awful lot of guts, and he was a very strong individual and had a reputation throughout Brazil as a fighter. And so, as a commercial endeavor, a fight was arranged between Kimura, who had a reputation as a professional wrestler, and Helio Gracie, who had a reputation throughout Brazil as a fighter. This became one of the most famous fights in history, especially since the modern day marketing, because Helio Gracie is listed in history as the winner of the fight.
Mm-hmm.
The fight took almost almost an hour and a half. The two of them went against each other, but they had no rules. They had no way of saying who was the winner or the loser, except that one of them would have to give up in order to be the other one to be the winner. So when they were fighting, Kimura finally he kept throwing, because he was a judo and a wrestler. He kept throwing Gracie time after time after time, throwing him to the ground. And Gracie would bounce right back up and come back at him. And he kept throwing him, he'd come back up. And to Kimura, that was a point. That was the end of the match. To Gracie, it wasn't. It wasn't in the rule book. So he'd bounce up and he'd come right back at him to fight. And they'd go at it again. So Kimura finally got tired of this crap, and he took him to the ground. And when he did, he armbarred him. And Gracie didn't tap out. He wouldn't give up. So Kimura broke Gracie's arm. Gracie still would not give up. He wouldn't tap out. So Kimura armbarred him again, same arm, and broke it again, different place. Gracie still wouldn't give up. So the referee called the end of the match. Gracie refused to give up. Consequently, he won the match. In history, it goes down. Helio Gracie beat the great Kimura. But even today, the armbar that was utilized against Gracie is called the Kimura. And win, lose, or draw, according to the Brazilian way of thinking, the man didn't give up, so he must have won the fight. Kimura, according to the rest of the world, beat the shit out of Gracie. And in essence, he actually would have won the fight because he kept throwing him, kept pinning